Dobrý večer, ráda bych vás přivítala
Good
u další
evening
diskuzi
and
Inspiračního fóra.
welcome to yet another debate from the Inspiration Forum. We will speak about today's Africa, and we will speak about, more specifically, we will speak about migration. And I'd like to tell you that we have these streams every day at 6:30 and 8:30, and you can watch us on Facebook and YouTube. And now I'd like to give the floor to the host of this debate, Tereza Hronová. She's the media coordinator at People in Need Foundation. Good evening. And I am saying hi from my COVID refuge in a village in a rural area of the Czech Republic. And I hope that our connection will be sufficiently good to enjoy our next debate. The topic is What Moves Africa? And I hope that our guests will help us understand the development of migration, the various trends, and where Africans migrate from. And my guests today are Peter Tinti. He's an American journalist focusing on conflicts, security, human rights, and organized crime. And he's received many awards for his work, and he appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, for example. And he is one of the best journalists focusing on organized crime. And my second guest is Tereza Němečková from the Department of International Trade at the Metropolitan University of Prague. She's been focusing on the economic development of Africa, and she's been attracted to Morocco recently. So we will discuss migration. I used to go to Africa quite a lot when it was still possible, and I'm happy that at least virtually we will be able to travel all together. And before launching the debate, I think that we could start with an opening question for both of you. I think that migration is quite a common phenomenon. It has always been like this, and it will remain like this. So why should we discuss this topic in relation to Africa? Can you please start, Peter?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this event. It's a real honor to be here, and I hope that everyone can hear me okay from over here in the US. I think part of the reason this debate is so important and this discussion about migration, particularly within the context of Africa, is that it is a phenomenon that has always existed, migration, of course, and is going to continue to exist and become a more important, I think, political issue, both domestically in many countries and also at the international level. We're increasingly seeing that issues of migration, the movement of people, refugee crisis, displacement, issues of displacement are driving many of the political and security agendas at the international level. And we can have a debate over whether that should be the case and whether migration is being appropriately framed within these debates. But at the most basic level, these are issues that everyone needs to pay attention to because they are having a profound impact on our lives, on the way we are shaping our societies, on our governance, on our economics, and at a very fundamental level, how we exist in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And Tereza, can you please respond? Good evening, and I also would like to thank you for inviting me. Hello from Prague, and I will maybe speak within the Czech context. I think that in the long term, Africa is being portrayed quite negatively in our media. The space given to Africa is not balanced. Media are overwhelming us with negative reports, and migration is central to this. And unfortunately, this is just a small part of discussion about African migration. I think that when you say African migration, many people just imagine those full boats on the Mediterranean Sea, and that's the only image that they can actually imagine, because the media are not speaking about anything else. But I hope that our debate will help them to have a more broader view. I know that the migration is a complex issue, and it's not only bad, it can also have a positive impact. We should also adopt a different point of view. Let me follow up on your response. When we say migration and Africa, the image that comes up in our mind is exactly the one that you described. But migration can be different and diverse. So can you tell us who are African migrants? What is the difference between economic migrants and refugees? What is the difference between them? Can you maybe continue, Tereza? Yes, definitely. Migration generally is perceived as international or cross-border migration. So people are born in one country and then they live and work in a different country. Or we have also migration within countries. People do not cross borders. They just leave the place where they're currently living and move to a different place. But there are both types of migration in Africa. According to the International Organization for Migration, roughly 30 or 32 million people are affected by migration. These are Africans who are living in a different country than their country of origin, within Africa or outside of Africa, which is mainly Europe, the US, or the Middle East. And in terms of migration within countries, we don't have data. We don't know how many people are concerned, but we know that this is something which moves Africa. That's the topic of our debate. Africa is undergoing economic development. Some countries are better off. Other countries are worse off, but the connecting link with the rest of the world is globalization, which obviously affects Africa as well. And one of the effects of globalization are rising cities and growing cities, and globalization usually affects these cities. These are huge cities that have over 10 million inhabitants. So these inner migration usually means that people in Africa leave rural areas and they move to the cities. We can, whether their lifestyle is better in the city, is better than in the rural area, that's a question. Why do they migrate? That's for security reasons, and for example, and they either go to a different region within the country or they cross the borders. And in terms of security reasons, we often speak about refugees, people who cross the borders and try to seek international aid and protection, and those who do not cross the borders and they stay within their countries. They are called internally displaced people, which is not a very specific term, but it means that these people do not enjoy international protection and they are under the authority of local states. There are roughly 10 million internally displaced people in Africa. This affects, for example, South Sudan, Cameroon, Central African Republic, countries that are affected by inner conflicts. So we have to adopt a dynamic point of view because there are various forms of migration, even within Africa.
Speaking of African migrants, I'm also asking who are the people who leave the African continent and reach Europe, for example. And Peter mostly focuses on international migration and organized crime, which sort of surrounds this migration that I'm referring to now. So could you please follow up on this and tell us who are the Africans who leave Africa and who don't stay in Africa, who migrate outside of Africa? Who are they?
Sure. Well, it's a very complicated question. There isn't exactly one profile of the type of migrant or asylum seeker who arrives in Europe. There might be several different itineraries and motivations that bring people to Europe. The first are people who are fleeing conflict. That's the most straightforward answer, and those are the most clear-cut cases when determining and trying to categorize someone as an asylum seeker versus an economic migrant. But those definitions, even though they seem very clear on paper, are often very hard to determine. And increasingly, when we talk about things like climate change, global inequality, these distinctions between if someone is migrating or moving for economic reasons versus security reasons are pretty hard to untangle. The second category, I think, well, one thing that I think is very important to understand here too, especially if we talk about organized crime, is the role of smugglers and this very kind of important distinction between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. Now, these are terms that often get conflated and used interchangeably, in part because I think a lot of people don't know that there's a difference. And also, translation into different languages can sometimes complicate how these dynamics are perceived. But under international law, there's actually quite clear definitions between the crimes of migrant smuggling and human trafficking. And without going into all the kind of technical legal definitions, the most important distinction really is that human trafficking is when the person is being exploited against their will. They are being either transported or held captive or forced into some sort of labor agreement completely against their will. Whereas migrant smuggling technically is usually a willing buyer, willing seller transaction. It's I'm paying you to help me cross a border or to obtain fraudulent documents or anything that falls within these categories. And now, these two dynamics can often overlap and blur quite a bit as well. But it's important to keep these distinctions in mind because as we talk about how governments are responding to migration and efforts to securitize or militarize borders or to close borders, often these measures that require blocking migrants or asylum seekers from arriving at a certain area are portrayed as efforts to combat human trafficking and to combat organized crime, when in reality, the dynamic that's at work is they're using the fact that everyone is against human trafficking as an excuse to implement policies that are really designed to block asylum seekers. And so I think in all of these debates and all of these discussions, when we talk about people living at borders and what rights they have, it's important to note that under international law and according to most countries who have signed the convention, people have the right to seek asylum. And so much of the debate about migrants arriving in Africa is obsessed with determining whether or not these people are real asylum seekers versus economic migrants. And as the world gets much more complex, I think we'll probably need to revisit some of these definitions, or at least accept that they're not nearly as clear as we often think they are.
Okay, in general, this is a very complex topic, but hopefully we managed to shed at least some light into it. We've already started this a little bit. Could we please talk more about the motivation? Why? What moves Africa? What are the factors? What makes Africans look for a new home elsewhere? Tereza, if you want to start, maybe? Well, I may start. I may try to focus on the economic reasons which are often listed. There's a page called Afrobarometer. It's an internet site. They do polls among Africans regarding various themes, including migration. And according to the Afrobarometer, it seems that economic reasons, which means search for better jobs and escape from poverty, are often mentioned as the main reason why people are leaving Africa, their homes in Africa, to look for work elsewhere, whether it's in the city, in a different country. And of course, security reasons, I think Peter will tell us more about that, are the second most important reason. I think in case of the economic reasons, it's important to mention that Africa right now is a very specific region in the sense that the local population is growing rapidly in numbers, while only a few years ago we were talking about Asia as the region with the fastest growing population. Today, it's Africa. Apart from that, the African population is very young. 60% Africans are younger than 25 years, is the usual statistic that's cited. And if you look at the structure of the economies, they tend to be sort of backward in the sense that many people work in agriculture. If we were to talk about industry in Africa, it's mostly mining or natural resources extraction, but there aren't very many industrial jobs. Recently, services started developing in Africa, which gives a certain hope for the region that the region could go in the services sector. But I want to say that there's a huge unemployment among young Africans. That's their number one problem. There's a huge number of unemployed young people in Africa, and the huge mass of people entering the job markets in Africa is too big. The African economy is unable to absorb. I'm always fascinated by numbers from South African Republic, which is considered the most advanced African republic. In the South African Republic, among people below 25 years, there's up to 50% unemployed. The unemployment is up to 50%. So even the economy of South African Republic cannot generate enough jobs for the fast-growing young population. And that's exactly the population that wants new opportunities, wants a better life, and if they don't get this offered to them at home, they go and look for it elsewhere. One last thing maybe I want to say about economic migration. I guess we'll be talking a lot about migration to Europe, but actually a large part of the migrants, also according to all these polls and surveys, shows that a lot of them don't want to leave outside of Africa. Usually they want to stay in Africa. They want to go to a neighboring country, for example, to a country that's economically better off than their country. These young people are attracted to digital and mobile technologies. That's one of phenomena that is moving Africa. They're young people, so they're ready for technologies. So there are states such as Kenya or Ghana, perhaps even Nigeria or the South African Republic, which are now often mentioned as technological centers, technological hubs. Many people who left these countries to go to the USA and to get job experience in Silicon Valley, California, etc., they are coming back to Africa. There's the founding startups, their own technology companies, and technologies in some of these countries are very attractive. They attract workforce, and it's one of the trends why young people in Africa are moving to countries within Africa where this is being created, this is supported by the local governments, and it's very attractive to young Africans. Peter, do you want to add anything to what Tereza has just said?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and it's a point that Tereza just touched on, which is very important, is, I think when in this discussion, we always need to clarify, are we talking about irregular migration, or are we talking about just migration in general? And so much of what we're seeing is, yes, the vast majority of migration, both irregular and regular or legal within Africa, is taking place within Africa. And that in general, we often outsiders, I think, often fail to account for the extent to which migration is often a reflection of aspirations, a reflection of searching opportunities abroad, not because someone is starving or because someone has to move, but because they've determined for themselves that the opportunities they want are abroad. There's educational migration, employment migration. These aren't aspirations that are any different from people in the rest of the world who might seek to gain education abroad or to develop skills abroad. And so especially the booming youth demographic in Africa is more plugged in than ever, and seeking and more connected with not only the rest of the world, but there's a role that the African diaspora plays that's very important in helping many, especially young Africans, understand the opportunities that are out there or see firsthand opportunities that can be had abroad. And these communication, the way in which these messages are communicated back home and within the diaspora, so the people in Africa and both abroad, are often not always well understood by governments or policymakers in other parts of the world who just assume that the only reason someone would leave their country is because they had no other choice. And that's not the case at all.
Teď bych možná poprosila přepnout.
Now, I want to ask to switch back to the studio because we asked these very questions to the citizens of Ji.hlava. So we want to know what people of Ji.hlava said about what makes Africans look for a new home elsewhere. What makes Africans look for a new home? Of course, if they're in a situation where they know that they have no future ahead of them, they can't provide for a future for their children, then it seems to me natural I would do the same thing. I would want to live somewhere else where there's a future for us. Within Africa, I think it's the crisis and the fact that they have to, and if they go outside of Africa, perhaps they think they will be better off elsewhere. Economical, ecological stimuli. I think that we will all be in the same situation soon because the climate is changing. Now we're talking about theoretically what's making them migrate, and maybe in 10 years they will be talking somewhere else, maybe in the north of Europe. Why are we moving to north? Our system is kind of clear here. Maybe they see a path towards getting a balance in their life. Maybe they desire for a better life. The question is if they can find it here. Maybe they're not happy where they are. If I was hungry, if I had children who would have nothing to eat and they would look like the African children whom I only know from pictures, I'd really be thinking about moving elsewhere, even though I love this place. But who knows if in 50 years we won't be in the same place they are now.
Nevím, jestli už se znovu slyšíme.
I think
Já
that's,
jsem teda úplně neslyšela,
yeah,
co
can you
lidi z Ji.hlavy
hear? So I didn't actually hear the poll. I didn't hear the answers, but I can maybe imagine what they were. So I'd like to know to what extent climate change is one of the reasons making Africans migrate. We've already touched on this topic. So, Peter, can you maybe start speaking about climate change?
Sure. Well, it's an incredibly important question, and I think at least one, maybe two of the people in that video mentioned it, and how climate change is affecting different parts of Africa differently and more acutely. One area where it is particularly severe is in the Sahel, so an area of generally West Africa when we think of places like Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria. And these are places where people's livelihoods are really being impacted in ways where they have to, in many cases, abandon the ways in which they've been living and surviving and living peacefully and fruitfully for generations due to either droughts or flooding or long periods of heat waves. And this is fundamentally altering a lot of, and it's important to note here, one of the tragedies of climate change among many is that some of the populations that are the least responsible for driving up the climate with their consumption habits or their energy habits or their military industrial complexes are the very populations who are the most vulnerable to climate change. And so it is an injustice on two levels. On one, they're the least responsible, and two, they are the ones who are forced to adapt and to leave their homes as a result. So climate change is increasingly a driver of migration, but it is also, we have to be careful not always to draw a straight line between climate change and migration. It can often be climate change impacts the local political or security dynamics, which creates a situation in which people need to move. So there's often climate change is an underlying factor that can change the dynamics across an entire region that then leads to situations in which people are either forced to flee or decide to move. And I think that's a very important factor to keep in mind when we think about migration, especially forced migration. And again, when we start trying to untangle who counts as an asylum seeker or refugee and who counts as an economic migrant, when we think about issues of climate change, those distinctions become very much less clear than our legal parameters would like us to believe.
Mhm. Mě by možná zajímalo, jestli jsou...
I'd like to know whether there are some regions or states in Africa which are more connected to migration, whether there are some hubs or regions where migration is more common. It might be connected with the fact that these areas are more affected by drought, for example. Tereza, do you have an answer? I know something from international statistics, something about which regions are the most affected by cross-border migration. And according to statistics, this affects the most West Africa, as Peter has already said. I agree that it's quite difficult to distinguish who was affected by climate change, by economic reasons, by social reasons. When your climate changes, there's no water, there are long periods of drought, and you have no other resources of livelihood than agriculture, then you have to leave. And then it's difficult to say whether this is economic migration or climate migration. But West Africa is often being mentioned as a region where there are huge movements of inhabitants within the region. And the second region is Eastern Africa. For West Africa, there is one interesting point. These states have established an economic union. It's called ECOWAS. And now they're in a stage of free movement of people, which is quite a rarity within Africa. So they even have a project of unified passport. So something that we know from the Czech Republic or from the European Union. So even West Africa is now in this stage, but it's true that the reality is quite different compared to our reality in the European Union. But there is the highest circulation or movement of people, and that's also given by the fact that there is this certain freedom and people can freely move between various states. And the East Africa is also approaching this stage. They also have a union and they are also approaching the stage of free movement of people. But there is one specific aspect about this region, a huge part of people actually decide to leave this region. They don't want to leave, stay within this region, but they want to leave, and they go either to Europe or to the Middle East. They seek job opportunities there, and the price of work is higher there than in Africa. And but West Africa is well known for the fact that cooperation. Well, actually, I'm speaking about Algeria and Morocco. It's impossible to cross the borders between these two countries. So North Africa is different in this, and people usually leave this region and they go to Europe, mostly to Europe. Sometimes they go also to the US. So back to your question, it's West and East Africa, and then it's also South Africa, where there is South African Republic, which attracts labor force, many refugees from Zimbabwe. There is this huge migration wave between Zimbabwe and South Africa. But the problem is that their economy is in huge problems, which were even worsened by coronavirus, by COVID-19. For South Africa, we know that over the last 3 months, they have lost 50% of GDP in year-to-year comparison. They went into lockdown, similarly to South European countries at the beginning of the year, and the impact was huge. So we'll see what will be the impact to refugees, because when the economic situation in the host country worsens, the situation of refugees or asylum seekers worsens as well. So, Tereza, where are the Africans that we can see in the Czech Republic from? I checked the Czech statistics. There is one strange thing. There are roughly 600,000 foreigners living here in the Czech Republic, which is quite a lot. There are 2,000 people from Africa, people with African nationality, and they come mostly from North Africa. So we copy the European trend. We have people from Egypt, roughly 600 Egyptians, people from Turkey, from Morocco, and from sub-Saharan Africa. We have people from Nigeria, but also people from South Africa, from Botswana, and also people from Libya, but not many people from these countries, just 20, mostly people from North Africa. And I have another question for Peter. It's about international migration to Europe. How do people cross to Europe? What are the paths? What are the hubs? How do people from sub-Saharan Africa come to Europe?
The vast majority, and again, in this case, I'm speaking about people who arrive irregularly, so without a visa, flying by plane. There are really a few main crossings. The first and one that is not as common now for African migrants and asylum seekers was the Eastern Mediterranean crossing. So that which connected Turkey to Greece. That was the crossing that drew the most international attention during what was called the refugee crisis of mostly Syrian refugees crossing via that route. But then migrant populations from other parts of the world also started entering those flows. So that was one major crossing. The other main crossing is what's called the Central Mediterranean crossing. And these are often what people think of most often when discussing migration from Africa to Europe. And those are boats leaving mostly Libya, but also to lesser circumstances, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, to reach either Italy, often via Sicily, or southern Spain. And there's a third route, which is less common, although actually rebounding and becoming more common in the last few months, which is from the West African coast to the Canary Islands, which are part of Spain. And so those are boats in which migrants are loaded onto boats and taken to the Canary Islands. The most common the itinerary that's drawn the most attention and is the most common still are migrants from sub-Saharan Africa traveling overland through either Niger or Chad to reach Libya. And upon entering Libya, they'll continue to pay smugglers to take them to the Libyan coast, from where they'll pay to be put on a boat that attempts to reach Europe. And that is a route that's become popular for several reasons, but the most salient one is the fact that there's no government in Libya that's capable of basically policing those borders. And that is a legacy of, really the revolution and intervention and war in Libya that led to the downfall of the former dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And the history here, I think, is quite important because previously various European governments worked quite happily with Gaddafi to more or less be their border guard. So in exchange for payments and cooperation, Gaddafi would agree to make sure that boats didn't leave the Libyan coast. And in fact, this was both sides of this agreement knew what was really at work, and Gaddafi, in kind of one of his more candid moments and basically using the racist language that everyone knew was playing to the very kind of xenophobic fears of many European governments. He even said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I could turn Europe black if I wanted to. So he was very aware of the fact that Europe needed him, at least in his view, to block migrants from leaving the Libyan coast in order to make sure that there weren't these waves of migrants. And he very much played into this rhetoric, saying, if you don't work with me, there's going to be waves of migrants arriving in Europe. Now, waves of migrants has always been a overstatement, and often the numbers just don't bear that out. But it's absolutely true that the chaos in Libya led to an opening in which more migrants could seek the services of smugglers to be smuggled to Europe. And that has really fundamentally altered a lot of the ways in which European governments are engaging with both North African states through security partnerships, but also with states that are transit countries and also source countries. So there's been a lot of talk about development projects in places like Mali or in places like Nigeria to make it so that migrants are less likely or less tempted to try to move. But there are all sorts of complications with this approach as well, given that just because a migrant is not starving doesn't mean, and if there's development project that has increased their quality of life even just a little bit, that doesn't mean they still might not seek opportunities abroad or be tempted to seek opportunities abroad.
Mm-hmm. Vy jste se už dostal trochu k té
You already touched on the infrastructure that's connected to migration. So could we elaborate on that, explain more about it? To what extent do the local communities profit from migration in the hubs that migrants traverse on their way to Europe? For example, Agadas is a very known for that, where migrants spend some time waiting for the smugglers to take them over to Europe.
Yeah, that's probably the most clear example of how migration economies and migrant smuggling economies or mobility economies can really emerge. So the town that you mentioned, Agadez, is a city in the middle of Niger, kind of right where the savannah ends and the Sahara Desert really begins. And from north of Agadez all the way to Libya is really, if you want to move in that territory, you probably need to pay someone or a smuggler to carry you there. The interesting dynamic here, and this is something that Tereza touched on, is Niger is a member of ECOWAS, that Economic Community of West African States. So any citizen of an ECOWAS country can travel to Agadez freely without a visa. All you need is your documentation that says you're a citizen of an ECOWAS state, and it's a matter of taking a few buses there. Or you could fly. But the issue is then once you reach Agadez, you have every right to move north, but there just aren't really public transport options, so people would pay smugglers. And this became a very common route, so common that there were hundreds of pickup trucks with anywhere from 15 to 20 migrants in the back leaving Agadez every week during the height of the popularity of this route in 2014, 2015, 2016. And the political economy that emerges around this is quite vast. So if there are going to be all of these migrants here, you're going to have people who want to sell them goods that they need for their journey, or provide lodging as they wait, or restaurants that cater specifically to migrants, or money changers, or banks that open. Additionally, the Nigerian military was providing escorts through the desert so that these migrants would be protected. And in fact, they were seeking rents and charging kind of a service to the caravans in order to fund their ability to protect these caravans. And there was even a study by an anti-corruption agency in Niger that found that some of the military units that were operating along this route were reliant on these revenues in order to fund their own activities for gas, fuel, foodstuffs, their basic necessities. So around all of these migrant hubs, there's lots of political economies that emerge and lots of actors who benefit from these activities, not all of whom are, criminals or organized crime. It's just part of a general mobility economy. And so when policies are implemented to crack down on this type of activity, policymakers really need to take into account what might be the negative externalities and the issues that result from these types of because they're not just this isn't just a crackdown on migration. This is a crackdown on an entire economy and on the way in which entire communities live.
Terezo, chcete doplnit?
Do you want to add anything, Tereza? No, I don't think so. I think Peter said the most important things. Just one thing, the last thing he mentioned probably has to do with the current situation with the pandemic. It's good to realize that the African economies, Peter has described that very beautifully, work as informal economies in large part, because a lot of people are dependent on informal economies. So they aren't registered by their governments, they don't pay taxes, they're not a part of the economic system as we know it in Western Europe or Europe, but a lot of them live in ways that every day they have to make a living. They go to a market, they go to the fields, they go in the mines. Every day or every week they get their wage, and they exist in a sort of an informal economy that they're not able to pay for services from the formal sector, but they have to go to a market, go to smugglers. They don't even have money to pay for an official bus ticket from one place to another. So we need to realize that as well, especially and also in context of the current situation when some African countries, and that's another question for discussion, some of those African countries, when the pandemic started or the pandemic spread, they decided to implement the same solution as developed countries. They shut down their economies. Some of them did it in a very strict way. And there's a great discussion, what do we do with these people who live this informal economy, who need a day-to-day job, need to go in the streets, in the markets, in the mines to make a living, to make money. to live on. So it's just something I thought of in connection with Peter has said, that it's very good to realize that a lot of Africans live day by day. And if the local situation doesn't offer opportunities for this kind of people to make a living in this way, for whatever reason, then they start moving somewhere else. I would like to also say that the audience can also ask questions on all channels where we are broadcasting. You can ask questions, and I get these questions. So try to ask. One of these questions, for instance, is, hello, I would like to know if in any regions of Africa the economic situation is improving, and how does it impact migration? So Peter, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I'm sure Teresa, as an economist, will have plenty to say on this as well. So briefly, I'll add that one, it's with the situation with coronavirus, it's a little tricky to really to make definitive statements about how economies in Africa are doing right now. It's the pandemic has affected different countries in different ways. But there are actually two main factors that I think have impacted migration quite a bit when it comes to coronavirus. The first is that borders have been closed. Borders that previously were wide open are now either formally closed and also being monitored and surveyed more strictly. And that is particularly the case in West Africa, where many of these ECOWAS borders that were open in the same way that, say, the Schengen zone would be open have been closed. And this has really limited migration for a lot of citizens of West Africa. But second is, and this is something we don't have a great understanding of just yet, but will be interesting to think about going forward, is migrants who seek to reach Europe in order to work in the informal economies of Europe. So whether it's in the agricultural industry or to often work basically under the table or in the shadows, it's just not clear to what extent those opportunities will still be in Europe right now, and to what extent the labor markets that Africans would seek to join in Europe will be impacted by the economic fallout of coronavirus. Because it's important to note here that so much of the reason why people move is because they have trying to reach Europe irregularly is an investment. It costs, it requires a migrant and their family to put down thousands, sometimes over $10,000 in advance to be able to reach Europe. And so if it's not clear that that is an investment that will pay out, and oftentimes it's a generational investment, they're saying over the long term, having a member of our family reach Europe and work there and send remittances home is worth the investment. It's not clear how those calculations are going to change for prospective migrants.
Já jsem se ke koronaviru chtěla dostat hnedka potom.
I wanted to reach coronavirus right after that, but I think you just exhausted the theme. But I think the question from the audience was more like, if the African countries are getting richer or better off economically, does it mean that less people want to migrate from out of there, if I understood right? So maybe Tereza, do you want to say anything about that? Well, are some of these countries getting better off? Africa in general, over the past 20 years, I'm not talking about right now, but the years before, Africa was considered the second fastest growing region of the world after Asia. And it was a great discussion of what's behind this economic growth and where has it shown the most. And it turns out that the economies that were very dependent on natural resources, that in around 2010, 2015, they profited from this very much because the world economy there was a great demand for African natural resources. But in the recent years, this has been changing because natural resources have experienced fluctuations on commodity markets, and it seems that stable growth in Africa are those that aren't dependent on export of natural resources, but it's countries like Kenya or Rwanda or Ghana in West Africa or Tunisia in the north or Morocco. They are countries. I mean, it's maybe too much to say they have undergone an economic transformation, but they have experienced a more dynamic development and they managed to transform their economies. But the question is if this has a direct impact on migration or direct connection, because I must confess I can't really answer that question, because looking at the North African countries such as Morocco or Tunisia, even though they're doing rather well economically, they're also the countries that a lot of the people decide to leave and they're going to Europe from there. So I don't think it's really necessarily connected with their economies. It's also connected with what we call governance, the governance of the countries, how their public matters are managed. It's maybe a question of freedom, freedom to decide about your own life, which it seems to me is still a sort of an ache in Africa, that even in growing economies, and from economical point of view, you could consider them successful by African standards, at least. From the human rights aspects, they aren't the most successful or the best countries. Because, and when economies are getting richer and people are getting richer, then the more they want freedom as well. They want democracy. They want perhaps the something that they dream that we may have here in the West. And it's a kind of freedom to decide about yourself, about your own life. So I think that at a certain point, this becomes very important in their thinking, and this what makes them decide whether they leave the country or not. So it may not be only the economic situation. But I think we could say that people who are leaving the continent, who are going to Europe, they may not be the poorest Africans. They may be people who usually have money, or their whole family puts up money for their journey to Europe or somewhere else. Definitely, but also we have to realize that here in Europe there are big African communities, and often it's also the African communities or the relatives who put up the money so that the rest of their family can get to Europe if they don't have the money themselves. So the solidarity among them, their community society, works much more strongly than we may be able to imagine or admit to ourselves. And that's one of the factors, definitely, that contributes to it. So it isn't only about the people having money or not having money. It's also about the community or their brother family being willing to contribute to their trip. So they're trying to move either to Europe or to some other country. Peter, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just to illustrate with one point, I think just because an economy is growing or citizens' purchasing power is increasing, or populations become less poor or transition from low income to middle income, does not necessarily mean that there will be less outward migration. And this is why I think it's very important when we think about some of the policies that Europe and European countries in particular are taking towards Africa when it comes to development. You often hear, well, one of the reasons to encourage economic development in Africa and offer aid to sub-Saharan Africa is so that people will feel less motivated to migrate. And I think that's actually a quite misguided view. One, because it may not even be true. There's not really evidence that saying that just because someone transitions from low income to lower middle income, they'll be less likely to move. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that says, okay, now I can afford to migrate. But second, there is, I just don't think development aid should ever be really tethered to a political objective of then hoping that people will not want to integrate or into the global economy or move. Development is a good in and of itself that shouldn't necessarily be tethered to trying to keep people out of Europe. And I'll give one very specific example. I had been working on a project once in which colleagues interviewed people in rural Mali who had been recipients of aid that I believe was part of and it was an EU-funded project that was trying to set up some sort of small factory to help process agricultural goods. And the idea behind this was to provide the types of stable employment in a formal economy that would then make people from this community more likely to want to stay home. And some of the people we interviewed who got jobs at this factory said, this is great because now I'm earning enough money to be able to fund a trip to North Africa and maybe onward to Europe. So the ways in which people will, the ways in which economic development impacts outward flows of migration are often very case specific and are not always easy to predict.
My za chviličku budeme muset končit, ale přece jenom mě ještě zajímá.
We will have to finish in a moment, but I'd like to know one more thing. To what extent migration from Africa to Europe was influenced by the Syrian war, by the war in Syria? Because statistically, Syrians were more rich than Africans, and I can imagine that the price for being smuggled into Europe was increased because of Syrian migrants. Did the war in Syria have any impact on migration, Peter?
It absolutely did, not in terms of necessarily driving as a push factor for migrants from Africa, but it did play a factor in that there was a migrant smuggling infrastructure that was built around Syrian demand for smuggler services. And so many of the networks that were moving Africans, some of them, particularly on the Western Mediterranean route, I'm sorry, the Eastern Mediterranean route, so that is linking Turkey to Greece, those networks were very much developed under the need and the demand to smuggle people from Turkey into Greece. And there were Africans who joined those flows and were able to enter into that infrastructure in order to move. The same dynamic did happen in Libya as well, in which there were Syrians who flew to Libya and then wanted to take boats to reach Europe. And because they were many Syrian asylum seekers had access to more money than many of their African other African migrants did, they were able to kind of pay a premium and in some ways demand better smuggler services, safer boats, better infrastructure as a way to mitigate their own risk. And to a certain extent, Africans also joined that infrastructure. Although Syrians aren't really moving via Libya anymore, migration from Libya to Europe right now is mostly sub-Saharan Africans, North Africans, and to a large degree Asians as well. There's Bangladeshi migrants and migrants from that region who are traveling to Libya and then seeking to reach Europe via that maritime route.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question from one of our viewers. It's a very vast question, but let's ask it. So, which reform is needed for the migration and asylum system? So could you maybe give us some thoughts, ideas, how to improve the situation? Tereza, do you want to start? I don't know what was the question about, whether it was about the Czech Republic or Europe. I think that it follows up on the previous question, the huge migration wave that Europe experienced around 2015. which was provoked by the Syrian conflict. The European migration policy has been transformed quite a lot. Europe has realized that it was necessary, and there was a huge internal pressure to stop this wave and to stop it from happening again. We know that this situation in Southern Europe was very difficult. Many refugee camps have been established there, and the conditions in these camps are crazy. And we know that there was a huge tension within Europe, and European countries were unable to agree what to do with these refugees, and there is huge room for improvement in return policy. The moment we find out that the person is not eligible for asylum, there is a huge problem arises because we don't know what to do next with this person. Even though the European Commission has tried to sign agreements with various countries to return these migrants to their countries of origin, but African countries were refusing to sign these agreements because they were under the pressure of their local population. They saw it as a treason, so signing such an agreement. So if Europe finds out that these asylum seekers are not eligible to get an asylum, there's no way to return them back to their countries. So there is definitely room for improvement, and also external border policing is quite an issue. It's quite a problem to maintain human conditions for migrants, but at the same time to maintain rules of internal security. I think that in September the European Commission has came up with a proposal which is now being debated by the Parliament and the Council of the European Council. So this is a huge problem. There are many aspects on which European countries agree and other aspects on which they disagree. But I think that we have learned our lesson in 2015, and there is a certain reform of European migration policy, but more reforms are needed to avoid another similar situation, and we also need to find a solution for those refugee camps. Thank you. This reform, I'd like to ask the same question. Peter, I have the same question for you. Reforming migration and asylum policy, you could maybe speak about the American perspective.
Yeah, so speaking from the American perspective, we have a situation on our southern border right now where we are increasingly militarizing our border with Mexico. Some of these borders basically cut through cities that are the same community. When you think of in California, San Diego and Tijuana in Mexico, or in Texas, El Paso, and on the Mexican side, Juarez, these are major metropolitan urban areas that just so happen to have a border that runs through them. And the militarization of these borders cut off communities, make the everyday lives of people nearly impossible, and fraught with all sorts of uncertainty and unnecessary burdens. And at the same time, this militarization is having the impact of practically blocking asylum seekers to the extent that we've ended up with situations where we have a family separation policy in which families that arrive together, the children are separated from the parents. We have unaccompanied minors who are arriving and then being either pushed back into Mexico or being put into detention centers that are unsafe. And in all of these cases, these are policies that often the people who are proponents of these policies cite that the reason we need to do it is deterrence. which is both really against international law. Everyone has a right to seek asylum, but also should shock all of our moral conscience. The idea of separating a 3-year-old from his mother in order to deter other migrants or asylum seekers from trying to reach the U.S. is just it's a moral outrage. And similar dynamics have taken place at European borders as well. Maybe not a formal child separation policy, but the situation with the camps in Greece, for example, have reached a point in which we should all be shocked from a humanitarian perspective. And so there's obviously broad systemic changes that need to take place within the framework of global migration policy and asylum policy. But I think one approach that all governments can take, as well as that citizens can demand of their governments, is at the very least a do no harm approach, to make sure that asylum seekers or irregular migrants or economic migrants have basic rights and basic needs that are adhered to. Because I don't think any of us should accept the logic that treating these people with dignity will lead to more people trying to arrive. The idea of stripping people of their human rights in the name of deterrence it's not a world I want to live in. And it's not something that I think in the year 2020, any of us should be accepting as a acceptable approach to managing migration flows.
Mm-hmm. Mám ještě jednu úplně poslední otázku.
I have one last question. Maybe it's a bit stereotyped question, but I'd like to ask it. Could each one of you mention one or two things what is migration good for? Because I believe that here in the Czech Republic, migration is word that is frightening for everyone. So could you maybe highlight some good points about migration? Tereza, would you like to start? Obviously, I think in economic terms, so there are some economic benefits. I think that the Czech Republic is a good example of this. We had experienced a huge economic growth, and we were happy for migrants who were arriving here. And some employers were begging the government to open the borders and to help more migrants and to receive more migrants because there were jobs, but there were no people and no labor force. But then migration also clashes with economic crises. When there is an economic crisis, there are no jobs, and we don't know what's next for these migrants, whether they will receive social benefits or they will have to leave. So we always have to think within the context, but also migration means cultural enrichment. It means that we meet a different country. If our neighbor is a foreigner, it's culturally enriching. And if you know a foreigner, I think that you can confirm this. It helps us to get to know ourselves, actually. And I think that if we close our borders, that would actually deprive us of this enrichment, because we used to live within communist closed borders. Our parents lived in this closed, sealed country, and they were afraid of foreign cultures, and we don't want this. I think that our young generation doesn't want this. We are happy to travel around Europe and to get familiar with other cultures, and I think that this is something which is beneficial to us. Peter, would you like to add something?
I think Tereza spoke very eloquently on that, so I don't have much to add other than, from the perspective of an American, where we have a culture of immigration, and where, obviously we have a very ugly legacy of being a place where, we're all living on land that was stolen from indigenous communities, and at the same time is a place where, aside from Native Americans who were here before any of the settlers and immigrants, all of us have an immigrant background, and it's hard to I mean, almost everything I value and cherish about my country is related to the fact that it is a melting pot and a dynamic place where people from all over the world interact, a place where people from all over the world want to come and contribute and live. And you know, my life, you know, I know where my ancestors came from, and I wouldn't be here had they not migrated. And almost everything I love about living in the US is a result of the fact that it is a diverse country with many different cultures. And I think in a globalized world, everyone should want to live in a world where they can visit other places and other people can come and experience their culture. As Tereza says, I think it enriches us all.
Mm-hmm. Děkuju moc. Myslím, že náš čas se na...
Thank you very much. I think that our time is up. Thank you very much for taking part in this debate. I think that the main finding is that migration is a very complex topic, and there is not one single view that there is internal migration within African states, which is often which concerns often many more people than international migration. We also spoke about migration structure and infrastructure that is also connected to smuggling. And I think that COVID-19 has also impacted migration. So we'll see what will happen when this pandemic ends, whether the situation will go back to where it was before. But I'm happy that to wrap it up, we said that migration is not only something that we should be afraid of, but it's something that brings us new experiences, something that enriches us. Now I'd like to say goodbye. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the viewers who watched this debate, and I know that online debates are not as exciting as live debates in person, but still, thank you for watching. I'd like to thank all the panelists for this fascinating debate. I'd like to invite you to yet another debate at our Inspiration Forum. It will also be a debate about Africa. Tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. we will speak about climate change in Africa. So see you on our Facebook and on our YouTube channel. Have a good evening.